Hello, my name is Diane Cox. I'm from Omaha, and the story I'm going to tell you today is about my husband's great, 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 great grandmother. Lucinda wiped a tear from her eye as she pushed back at the fear that was gripping her heart. She wrapped a still warm loaf of bread and put it in the oilcloth sack with other foods she'd packed. She checked to make sure that there was enough for them to make it to where they needed to be. There might be a time when they would be hungry, but it would not be now, and it would not be because of her. The boys came into the kitchen. They checked their gear to make sure they had everything. They had been uncommonly quiet at breakfast. Their usual banter was replaced with an uncomfortable silence. Now, their faces were filled with excitement and terror. Her boys were going off to fight in a man's war. Wiley's John and James towered over her as she gave them each a hug, and they bent down to get a kiss on the cheek. "You keep your head down, you hear?" "Yes'm." They may not have been her flesh and blood, but she'd been their ma for a while now, and she cared very much for them. And then there was her Johnny, her oldest. He looked so much like his pa, it made her heart hurt. She held him longer, desperately trying to keep the tears from flowing. She was not going to allow a tear-stained face to be the last thing he saw of her today. Then Wiley came into the room, said my farewells to the young'uns. "Everything ready to go?" "Yes, Pa," said the boys. Lucinda opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out. No matter. He pulled her close and wrapped his arms around her. And then he kissed her. He kissed her long and hard. And oh, that kiss held so many emotions for the two of them. The boys grinned as a blush crept up her cheek. "Well, we'd best be going." She stepped back as Wiley picked up the sack of food. "Lord, woman, did you pack the whole larder in here?" But before she could protest, he grinned and slung it over his shoulders. "Thank you, dear." Then they all picked up their guns and their traps, and they headed out into the pre-dawn darkness. Lucinda walked with them across the yard to the edge of the trees, and then one more kiss and one more farewell, and they were gone, their shadows blending in with the shadows of the trees. The sky was clear. The moon was full enough it would be easier travel. They'd be taking the hills and hollers most of the way, well, at least till they crossed over the border. Tennessee was officially a Confederate state, but there were many who did not want their loyalty to their country of their birth denied. The state was sorely divided. Some stood with the decision of the state government in Nashville, and others weren't going to be dictated to by those hotheads over in Richmond town. Many a political discussion ended in shouting and bitter words, and sometimes even shots fired. And now Wiley, who had managed to stay out of those discussions, was taking the boys and crossing the border into Kentucky, where they would join the Tennessee Volunteers for the Union. Said he didn't want to be drafted into a cause, to fight for a cause that he didn't believe in. Druther fight to keep his country in one piece, rather than whether some rich landowner could own other human beings. Lucinda knew that any information about her menfolk had to be kept close to her chest. They had just developed a local security force. Well, it was more of a vigilante squad than it was providing any security for the community. This part of Tennessee had many leanings towards the Union, and it had to be watched. Lucinda hoped to keep the children home in a low profile so that the security force would have no reason to visit their farm. The children had been schooled in what they could and could not say to folks outside of the family, how to answer politely without really telling anything. If they shared no secrets, then none could be betrayed. And right now, they could rely on no one, confide in no one, trust no one. At least Wiley and the boys had managed to get the harvest done and stored before they left. That was a relief. It was a good harvest, too. It would carry them over the winter, and there would be seed for planting in the spring, and then everyone would have to chip in to make that happen. She looked again where they had disappeared into the night. She knew that there would be few, if any, letters sent home. She'd taught the boys how to read and write, but they hadn't cottoned to it the way she had hoped. Wiley had some skills, but he thought it was more important that the children had the learning. She sat down on a stump nearby, not ready to break this last connection with him. And as she sat there, she thought over her life. She had already buried 3 husbands. She'd been so very young when she first married, and he had been so much older than her. She'd been not much more than a glorified housekeeper and bed warmer. But he'd been kind enough to her, and when he died, he left her a piece of land. Her pa farmed that until she was married off again. She chose not to think too much of this one, and she chose to forget the abuse that he had inflicted on her. She was happiest when he was out tending his still, but when he sampled his product, she bore the brunt of his rage brought on by the alcohol. She didn't remember even shedding one tear when a run-in with the revenuers cut his life short. Unfortunately, her home and her land had to be sold to pay off his sizable debts. And then there was Greenberry Satterfield. His name was almost music. He'd walked into the room and her world had turned upside down. Lord, she loved that man. She loved him. Well, she had a love with him that she had never felt before. She felt like her life was perfect. They worked their own land, and when the babies came, she felt as if, well, the angels were smiling at her. But then came that other war, that Mexican War. And Greenberry thought he had to go off and fight. Why, wasn't it one of Tennessee's own, President Polk, that said they needed to fight for their country? He didn't even see one battle. Malaria never gave him a chance. And he came home just in time to die in her arms. That's when she decided she would never marry again, never love again. It hurt too much. But a life caring for the land without a man to share the load is hard. And when Wiley Parker came along, it just seemed to work out. He needed a ma for his boys as much as she needed a pa for her children. He was a good man, a man of conscience. And they settled into a life that was beneficial for both of them. They worked the land, they cared for the children, they took care of each other. She hadn't planned on falling in love with him, but she had. She would miss him terribly while he was gone. And the thought of never being able to see him again, never being able to hold him again, made the breath catch in her throat. And the boys, she didn't want to even contemplate what their future might be. They were gone. And she had done her best to send them off right. But they were gone. She lifted her face to the brightening sky, and she said a prayer, a fervent prayer aloft. Dear Lord, kind Lord, take care of my Wiley. He's a good man. And the boys, John, James, Johnny, they'll be good men too if you give them a chance. Bring them back to me. Please, please, sweet Jesus, bring them back to me. And that's when the tears began to flow. First a few, and then they became unstoppable, and perhaps that was best, that she cried now before the children were around. Mama? Mama, are you all right? Lucy had come up on her so quiet she hadn't realized she was there. Yes, I'm fine. She wiped her tears with her apron. I'll be fine. They get gone okay? Yes, they're gone. And I haven't heard any gunshots. So they'll be miles gone by now, the way they walk. Never could keep up with them if they got it in their head to be somewheres. I know, she said. And then the words, miles gone, hit their mark. The thought of how much had to be done and how it had to be done made the load seem that much heavier. But the load would be carried, and they would do it. She looked at her daughter and knew that, yes, the load would be carried, but it would have to wait, because there were children to be fed. There were chores to be done. So then, taking Lucy's hand, she turned and walked to the house. We'll rise above the scarlet tide that trickles down through the mountain and separates the widow from the bride. Thank you.